Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PSL meeting hosted by the American Enterprise Institute and the Open Source Policy Center. Thanks very much to everyone who has joined us, and I hope you're doing well at home during this period. And thanks in particular to Dr. Jason DeBacker for joining us today. We need to welcome Jason back. He's spoken with us before, and today he'll be talking to us about the Overlapping Generations USA model, OGUSA, a new web application, and he'll be answering any questions that I have and that all of us have. So if you have any questions during the event, please feel free to email them to peter.metz, M-E-T-Z, @aei.org, or you can post them on Twitter, #AskPSL. Jason DeBacker is an associate professor of economics at the University of South Carolina's Darla Moore School of Business. He has incubated a number of projects with the Open Source Policy Center in the past, including the OGUSA model that he'll be discussing today, as well as the cost of capital calculator. He's also helped considerably with my work and others on the tax calculator project. And he's been actively involved in all of the modeling that we've been doing. Before his time in academia, he was actually a financial economist at the Office of Tax Analysis at Treasury. And so he's been working on this type of project and these types of challenges for many years now. Jason, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be here. No Chick-fil-A today, but glad we could all get together somehow.
Yeah, we've got these spicy deluxe sandwiches that are just like floating around in my head for the last few months. Have not had one, but I'm thinking about it. So Jason, first of all, I know we're going to get to your demo later on in the event. Hoping to ask you a few questions before we get there. What is OGUSA? Can you just give us a brief overview?
Sure. OGUSA, the name of the model I'll be speaking about, is an acronym for Overlapping Generations Model of the United States. It's a model to look at fiscal policy in a dynamic setting. So the model includes households that are heterogeneous, that is different in their kind of earnings ability. You could think of skill level. And what the model is well suited for is analyzing the decisions of these individuals over their lifetime. So it's really useful to take into account how tax policy or other fiscal policies affect individuals across their lifetime, and then the economy across different generations of these individuals.
I see. And so what are the primary goals for the project? Why is this particular type of model helpful for policymaking?
Right. So this is useful because just thinking in terms of the suite of models that the Policy Simulation Library currently has cataloged, the tax calculator does a great job with micro simulation. So looking at revenue estimates in the absence of behavior, or maybe applying some micro behavior to it, but it does not include, say, how those changes in tax policy affect the macroeconomy. And OGSA helps to forecast what might happen to the economy as a result of these changes in tax policy. So it could be thought of as something that is maybe an input for the economic baseline that's used in a micro simulation model like tax calculator. It's also useful for just understanding longer term impacts of fiscal policy.
I see. And so generally, if we're trying to do some sort of dynamic modeling, if we want to understand the economic feedbacks, or if we want to try to generate a baseline that takes into account economic feedbacks, then this is going to be helpful. Why overlapping generations? You mentioned that it's helpful because we can follow these people through their lifetime, but how, in the particular context of dynamic scoring of tax policy proposals, how do I think about overlapping generations as it compared to other options?
Right. So there are a number of different models that are used to look at the dynamic effects of fiscal policy. Some of those include kind of macroeconomic forecasting models that are models that don't model individuals' specific behavior, but rather just look at kind of relationships between aggregate time series. And that's one way to go about modeling things, but there you don't get the detail of what happens to different individuals. You also are making some assumptions about how past relationships between tax rates and GDP were governed, and those might change depending upon specific policy parameters. Another class of models that's used are what are called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Those are very useful in particular for short run analysis and thinking about the impacts of fiscal policy over a business cycle. And then the overlapping generations is maybe the most commonly used model for fiscal policy analysis because of its nature of being able to analyze effects over lifetimes and across generations. And so that's important for questions about who's bearing the burden of the tax. And oftentimes when we think about fiscal policy, we're thinking about a policy that is going to affect taxes today, but at some point budgets have to balance, and those, like if revenues are short of spending in the current period, in some future period that needs to be made up for. And so with the overlapping generations model, you're able to take into account things like that and see how the impact of the tax is affecting not just the current generation, but future generations as well.
I see. How should I think about the core assumptions that I need to make when I start? Like if I'm not an overlapping generations modeling expert, which I'm not, how do I think about the assumptions that I need to make when I use one of these models and policy analysis?
Sure. So again, like I described, one difference between this model and those macroeconomic forecasting models is that in this overlapping generations model, we're modeling the behavior of each individual. So there's kind of the basic components of this model are things like a utility function of an individual or household, a production function for a firm. And so those are kind of the building blocks, and that's where kind of the base assumptions have to come in. What's going to govern people's behavior? Well, that depends upon what their utility function looks like, i.e. how they're trying to maximize some objective over their lifetime, okay? And so things that affect their utility and are parameterized in our model are things like how patient are they? Do they care a lot about income today versus income tomorrow? How much are they willing to substitute labor for leisure? Okay, if they get paid more, are they gonna work a lot more or not so much, okay? So there are some basic parameters that are going to govern decisions like that, which are going to affect how much they save, how much labor they supply to the market, and how responsive they are to tax policy. Likewise, on the firm side, their production function is going to take capital and labor as inputs and produce some output. But we want to think about, well, what share of capital and labor are used in the production of those outputs? What's the degree of substitutability between capital and labor in that production process? So this is going to play a role for how firms respond to taxes. As taxes change labor supply and change wages, do they employ more or less labor? How much more or less do they employ? And what happens to the capital stock as a result? And so really the fundamental building blocks of a model like this are agents' preferences and the production technology available to firms.
I see. And are all agents and firms the same? Do they have the same preferences and same capabilities?
Okay, so in our current version of OGUSA, we have agents that differ. So we call that heterogeneous agent modeling. And so those agents in our model differ by their skill level.
Mhm.
Skill level is kind of endowed to an individual over their lifetime, but different individuals have different skills. So you can think about low skill and high skill households, for example, and they might have different profiles of earnings over their lifetime. And so there's going to be differences across those households at any point in time. And there's also differences within a household at different times in their life. So for example, the model accounts for that people have higher earnings at middle age than they do when they're young or when they're very old. And so that kind of hump-shaped earnings profile is built into OGUSA. And so we're going to have agents at any point in time that are going to differ based on their skill level, based on their age, and potentially based on when they were born, so what cohort they're in, okay? Because they're going to endogenously, because of these different skill levels and their preferences and so on, they're going to accumulate different amounts of savings. And so agents are going to end up differing fundamentally by their skill level and when they were born. But as a result of their economic decisions they make, they're going to differ in their how much they consume, how much labor they supply, how much savings they accumulate.
What sort of data do you use to calibrate these sort of different avenues of difference?
Sure. Yeah. So we are trying to model a full life cycle of an individual, or really it's a household in our model. That is kind of the economic unit. And so what we need to kind of estimate something like the earnings profile over the lifetime of one of these households is we need some panel data. So the current calibration of OGSA is based on panel data from IRS tax returns. So we took a panel of 24 years and used that to estimate the earnings profiles of households who we put into different groups based on essentially their skill level. The skill level was identified through a measure that we call their potential lifetime earnings. So it's kind of an abstract concept, but some way to group people based on what, if everybody worked full time, how much could they earn? And that helped us group them into these different skill levels. And then within skill level, we would estimate the earnings profile. So how do your average wages change when you're 20, 25, 30, and so on throughout the life cycle?
I see. So as a associate professor of economics, you have quite a bit of latitude to decide which projects to work on and what to research and what your aims are of your portfolio. Why this? Why this versus anything else that you could be working on? Why OGUSA? Why tax modeling?
Yeah, so I've had an interest in tax modeling going on more than a decade now. I got involved with the Open Source Policy Center some years ago, and with OGUSA in particular, because it, was a model that was being built. I was answering the same types of questions that I was doing in my academic research, namely how responsive are things like aggregate investment and consumption to changes in fiscal policy. But kind of the unique thing that OGUSA has brought relative to academic work is in a typical academic paper, you might simulate a policy change and maybe you have some robustness analysis. So you do 3 or 4 different kind of incarnations of let's change some parameters and see how the results change. And then you kind of put those results away and you might write another paper and you get 3 or 4 other sets of results and you put those away. And OGUSA has brought this real challenge, and this is something we'll kind of highlight today on this web application that I want to demonstrate, which is how can you make a model that is something like what's used in academic research, but have it just run over and over again with many different parameterizations and many different inputs of tax policy. And how do you kind of overcome that challenge of, very technical things of like your initial guesses in these optimization routines can often matter. How do we kind of fix that and make it robust to these different inputs and different potential starting values? And so that's been a really neat exercise that's been fulfilling in other ways that academic research isn't. And so that's been part of the appeal for me with working on OGUSA.
I see. My understanding is that it's difficult to build too many parameters and too much like complexity of the policy world into an overlapping generations model as a matter of practice. Does that mean that in this model, we're just dealing with kind of highly stylized parameters that don't really reflect the real world, or how do you overcome that challenge?
No, it's a great point. We've talked about the heterogeneity or the differences in agents in the model. And I said things like agents in the model are going to differ over age and their skill level. And speaking in terms of these types of models, that's kind of the cutting edge of how agents differ. But of course, if we looked at, say, the income tax code of the United States, tax policies depend on all kinds of things like how many dependents are in your household, how much earned income did you have, how much capital income did you have. And so what we're trying to do in OGUSA, and what I think we've done a good job at relative to some other approaches, is that we've tried to model this complexity of the tax code as much as possible, given the limitations of a macroeconomic model, where in order for it to be computationally feasible, we can have only a limited number of differences across, say, households in the model. And so the approach we've taken there is to essentially integrate a microsimulation model into the overlapping generations model. And what we're doing, and what OGUSA does when you download the code and run it, or if you run it on the web app that I'll demonstrate shortly, is it's going to talk to the tax calculator microsimulation model. And it's going to have the tax calculator microsimulation model run a very detailed reform that you specify. And it's going to use that and simulate effective and marginal tax rates for each individual and whatever microdata you pass to tax calculator. And OGSA is going to take the resulting microdata, which is essentially going to be for each year and for each person in those microdata. So say you have a couple 100,000 observations, you're going to have an effective tax rate, and you're going to have marginal tax rates on labor income and marginal tax rates on capital income for all those individuals. And OGSA is going to then estimate some parametric functions to represent these effective and marginal tax rates. And it's going to do that in a way that you can specify, but kind of the most detailed way to do it, and the one that would take the longest to run, is we allow you to estimate tax functions that vary by age. So all these tax functions are going to have some functional form that's going to allow them to be progressive. That is, tax rates can change as income changes. In addition, we're going to allow the functional forms to vary across years. So if we have temporary tax policies like current law, many policies in the individual revenue code expire in 2025. And so those types of transitory policies are going to be modeled by allowing tax functions to differ year by year. And then we're going to capture some kind of more detail of the tax code that's we're unable to capture in our macro model by allowing functions to vary by household's age as well. And so a question we get a lot is, well, why do you have those tax functions vary by age? Not a lot in their internal revenue code depends on age, although some tax policy parameters do. But what's important is that in our model, we're missing things like portfolio decisions that individuals make in real life. And because there is differences in tax rates on, say, interest income and capital gains and dividends, we want to account for that somehow, even though we don't have an explicit portfolio choice decision built into the model. And so by allowing a tax function to vary by age, what we're doing is we're capturing, say, changes in effective or marginal tax rates on that capital income at different points in one's lifetime based on those portfolio decisions. So we can kind of proxy for those different compositions of your portfolio and how that affects your investment incentives and your tax burden by allowing those functions to vary by age. And you can think of a similar story. We're not modeling explicitly dependence in the households, but what we're doing is we're allowing those tax functions to vary by age. And so you can think of a tax function for a 45-year-old being different than a tax function for a 20-year-old, in part because there may be different numbers of dependents in those households on average.
I see. And another why question, but why a web app? Right. So we've talked about why you want to build a overlapping generations model. We've talked about why you want to build a model to begin with that has to do with tax policy. When you start working on a web app, I imagine that it adds another level of complexity to the technological work that you're doing. What's the payoff?
Yeah, that's right. So I think the most immediate payoff of having a web application for this model is you increase the number of people who can make use of it. So rather than having to know how to download and run some Python code, in this case, one only has to be able to use a web browser and navigate to a web page, and they can enter parameters there and get some feedback on what their particular parameterization of this model would imply for the path of the economy going forward. You're right, there's certainly a lot of technical hurdles to overcome. We've been working with a company called Compute Studio that's hosting our web application. And Hank Dupe, who's really heading up Compute Studio, has provided a lot of help in overcoming those technical complexities of building a web app. In addition, Hank's built something, another piece of software that is in the policy simulation library called Param Tools. And Param Tools isn't necessary for having a web app, but Param Tools is something that I think is just immensely useful for all kinds of modeling. And it's something we've made use of with OGUSA. And it essentially provides kind of validation and a standardization of inputs to a model. And that's helped tremendously in building things like this web application and made it a lot more streamlined to be able to take inputs from a web page, make sure that they're going to work with the model, and then be able to kick off a model run somewhere in the cloud based on somebody's input on this web page. Cool. So I've had a lot of help kind of getting this up and running, but it's been great to kind of work in that sense with others, but also with this challenge. Now, I spoke earlier about how one kind of appealing aspect of this model is just trying to overcome that problem of how can we get a complex model to run with a number of different parameterizations And now with a web app, we're really kind of scaling that up. And so anybody who wants to can come and run something. And we've got to be sure that what they put in is feasible and is going to work, and that they can expect something when the run is over in their inbox.
Right. Okay. So with that, Jason, why don't you demonstrate for us this open source model built on a open source web platform, and then some of our listeners feel free to try it out. And again, if you have questions for Peter during his demo or afterwards, feel free to email them to peter.metz, METZ, @aei.org, or on Twitter, #AskPSL, #AskPSL. Okay, Jason, it's on you.
Okay, let me share my screen here. I'm going to bring up a web browser. I'll show you where to go for this web application. All right, so I've got a browser window up, and this is the Compute Studio webpage for the OGUSA model. So if you wanted to navigate here yourself, you can just go to compute.studio. And from there, you can click on their drop-down menu and look at the different models available. You'll see a number of different PSL models available on the Compute Studio platform. So there's web applications for Tax Cruncher, Cost of Capital Calculator, and for Tax Brain, which is an interface for the tax calculator. So all those are available in addition to OGUSA. I'm on the specific URL now for the OGUSA model, which is just compute.studio/PSL models/OG-USA. Okay, what you're going to be brought to is a page that's going to describe the model. So just a brief description pulled from the GitHub repository for OGUSA. And then at the bottom of this description is a button to create simulation. And so if we click on that, we're going to be able to start a new simulation of this model. What this means is it's going to set us up to enter a parameterization that we may want to look at the economic effects of. Okay, so you can name your simulation, whatever you want to name this. And you can provide some description, which may be helpful. And then if you go down below, you begin to get to different inputs to this model. All right. And let me describe kind of in brief some of these, and then we'll kind of transition to a run I've done recently. Okay, so there's kind of some meta parameters, which are what year do you want to start this model in? And this will allow you to start the model run in any year that tax calculator can be run in. So right now this is up through 2030. We can choose our data source, which is either the current population survey or the IRS public use file. These are the data source for the microdata that tax calculator is going to use to simulate effective and marginal tax rates, which will become inputs to the OGUSA model. And then you have the option in OGUSA to choose, do you want to look at just very long run results, i.e. results of the steady state of the model, or do you want to also solve for the transition path of the model? Okay, which means you can look at the economic effects from the first year that you input, say 2020, through that kind of indefinite long run of the steady state. Okay, and you get year by year results from your start year through the infinite future. Okay, so you can just toggle that between true or false. Now, this model is somewhat computationally expensive. So if you click true for solving the transition path, your runtime is going to be something like 6.5 hours. Don't worry, you'll be emailed the results. You don't have to keep this browser window open while it runs. If you don't want to look at the transition path, but rather just the steady state, the runtime is about 1.5 hours. And that runtime, it's not very long to solve for the steady state of this model, but it does take some time to estimate these tax functions. And so that's where most of that time is being eaten up. Okay, so those are kind of the overall kind of what I'll call meta parameters of this model. Then we've got a number of parameters that we can enter in OGUSA. Okay, so it starts off here with first behavioral assumptions. So these are things governing the household's preferences. And so you get a preference parameter that represents their elasticity of labor supply. How willing are they to trade off labor for leisure as their wage rate changes? You can enter this rate of time preference for households. This is that thing I spoke of before, how patient is the household. So a higher number here is going to mean that households are more patient. They're kind of more equally value the current year versus the next year. Another parameter here that helps describe preferences is this coefficient of relative risk aversion, which is going to kind of give us a sense of this the utility function and its shape and how individuals might prefer a gamble in a lottery, okay? So a higher number here is going to mean that there's going to be more risk aversion and more curvature to their utility function, and that's going to affect their savings behavior. We have some kind of underlying economic assumptions. In particular, in this model, there's some underlying growth rate to the economy. So the model itself is not stationary, although we stationarize the model to be able to solve it. And so the default parameters are what you're seeing put into this, these boxes here in Compute Studio. And those are, here we have an assumption of an underlying long run growth rate of 3% per year. We can describe the firm's production function. So what is capital share of output? What is the degree of substitutability between capital and labor in the production function? And what is total factor productivity? So total factor productivity, you'll notice there's a plus. This is the first parameter we've seen that has a plus under it. So with OGUSA, we can allow things to vary over time. So perhaps we were thinking about maybe modeling what's going to be the result of the coronavirus and the shutdown in economic activity. So one way you might do that is maybe you could change total factor productivity in the first year and then say, okay, next year and thereafter, things will go back to normal. Okay, and so you could change parameters year by year when you see the plus under the input box. All right, so we can enter an annual rate of economic depreciation is another parameter describing the firm's production process. The model has a flexibility to be looked at as either a closed economy model or an open economy model. So there are the default parameterization is for a partially open economy. Okay, so you can say if you want to use a small open economy or not, which means that if it's a small open economy, the interest rate is going to be exogenous at the level of the world interest rate. And you can enter what that interest rate is below, and you can see the plus box underneath, so you could have that change year by year. When we have a partially open economy, as we do in the kind of default parameterization, the parameters governing that partially open economy are things like, well, what fraction of government debt is bought and held by foreign investors? And we have a share of initial debt that's held by foreigners. In the US, that's about 40%. And we assume that about 40% of new debt issues are going to be purchased by foreigners as a default. But you could, of course, change that parameter and you can have it vary over time. In addition, with a partially open economy, foreign investors are not going to buy just US government debt. They also might invest in domestic capital. And we're assuming as a default that 10% of the excess demand for capital is made up by foreigners. Again, a parameter you can change, and this one also able to vary it year by year. All right, so those are all parameters describing preferences of households, production or technology of firms. We can also now get to kind of the interesting stuff here for kind of the purposes of analyzing fiscal policy, which is what are the fiscal policy parameters, all right? And so I'm still here in parameters that relate to OGUSA. We'll get to, if you want to model the individual income tax code, those parameters are down this page a bit. But these fiscal policy parameters that we can manipulate here are as follows. So firstly, with the overlapping generations model, with a model where we're taking into account all of these factors of the economy, we have to determine some equilibrium result. We need to think about how's, in the long run, how is the economy going to manage to kind of close its budget up? In particular, we can't have debt rising faster than GDP indefinitely. And so we institute, in order to be able to solve the model, we institute what we call a fiscal closure rule, which is how does the economy come to some equilibrium and not be out of balance because government debt is growing faster than GDP forever, right? And so what we're going to do here, and what our kind of baseline assumption is that at some point in the future, government spending is going to adjust to balance the budget, okay? Now, you could have tax policy adjust, but all the tax policy parameters are up to you to enter, right? And so we give you a great deal of flexibility over entering the tax policy parameters. So we're going to say, okay, if you did something that is just infeasible and is going to result in an ever-growing budget deficit, one that grows faster than GDP, we're going to institute this fiscal closure rule. And the fiscal closure rule adjusts government spending in order to balance the budget. And it adjusts government spending starting at some point in the future. So the first kind of parameter of the fiscal closure rule you could enter here is, when do you want this thing to kick in? All right, so this is saying 20 years in the future. The next is, when do you want it to finally close everything up? Because you can have it happen in 1 year, or you can have it happen over a longer period of time. This is saying, let it happen over a couple centuries or more, 256 years. Let's close it up. So we'll do it slowly, but eventually we've got to get there. All right, and then this third parameter is kind of how quickly over those, in this case, 256 years, do we kind of adjust government spending to get that budget balanced. And then lastly, related to this closure rule is, we're going to balance the budget somewhere. So spending is going to equal revenue at some point, but when that happens, what's the debt to GDP ratio? And so you kind of enter what the target is. All right, so the default here is a 200% debt to GDP ratio. Okay. Again, an assumption you can change. We'll probably be at 100% debt to GDP at the end of the year. This is just saying we'll be at twice that in the very long run. Okay. But that's a parameter that you can input, as well as changing the timing of that closure. All right, so we're not providing detail with respect to policies of spending and so on, but we do allow you to change year by year what you think spending is going to be as a fraction of GDP, what we think government transfers to individuals, excluding Social Security, are going to be as a fraction of GDP. And then we're also going to allow you to change corporate income taxes and consumption taxes, parameters that aren't in tax calculator. So you can change those in OGUSA. You can change tax depreciation rules. So if you want to institute some kind of bonus depreciation or some kind of accelerated depreciation, that can be included. We've also got capabilities to model wealth taxes with a polynomial functional form. And these are some parameters of that. I won't get into detail on exactly what that functional form looks like, but you could find it in the OGUSA documentation. All right. You can enter payroll tax rates. You can change parameters of the Social Security system. So kind of age at which benefits can be collected, years used to compute your payments in retirement, and so on. So we've got kind of essentially all the parameters of the current Social Security system here that you can manipulate. Okay. And those are all things that are only a part of OGUSA and not a part of tax calculator. But as I mentioned before, tax calculator is going to help OGUSA model the individual income tax code. And so if viewers here are familiar with the TaxBrain web application or with the tax calculator micro simulation model itself, all the parameters that are available in that model can be adjusted here. And those are going to affect decisions in OGUSA, because we're going to have individuals' taxes in OGUSA be based on the parameters that one enters here. Okay, so we can think about changing parameterizations on payroll taxes, earned income, capital income, and so on. And so again, all of those parameters are here. And I wish my computer was scrolling a little bit better, because you could see, rather than going through this long list, on the left-hand side, there's a box where we can view just the OGUSA parameters broken up by section. And then again, if my scrolling were working a little bit better with this shared window, if you went down below OGUSA parameters, you would see tax calculator parameters, and those would all have their sections as well. So you could quickly navigate from one group to the other. This web app is only been up to the public for a few days, and the transition path equilibrium has only been available since about 6 o'clock last night. So this is all kind of fresh off the presses. But I've kind of walked you through the different things you can do and adjust. And that's everything from detailed individual income tax code parameters to fundamental behavioral parameters that are going to govern household decisions in the macroeconomic model. All right, so a lot of things to enter. Again, this was newly released. So I kicked off a few runs last night to look at results of a reform that may be of interest. And so I put in parameterizations of candidate Biden's policy proposals, and so you may be more or less familiar with those, but just a sense of some of the things that are going on in his plan. One is to increase the corporate income tax rate to 28% from its current rate of 21%. He also proposes adjusting a number of individual income tax parameters, including things like kind of rolling back the tax cuts that were part of the TCJA for high-income individuals over $400,000 in AGI. He also proposes increasing payroll taxes, so essentially kind of reinstating payroll taxes at a level above $400,000. Those that are currently capped now. In addition, increases in capital gains income for high-income capital gains tax rates for high-income individuals, among some other proposals. So what I did is I tried to model what we could model within Tax Calculator and OGUSA. And so those are things like what I just described, and those exclude some things like some various changes in specific tax credits and so on. But we did get a number of his proposals that we're able to model here, including things like changes in the age of EITC eligibility and phase outs for itemized deductions and so on. And then I put in those individual income tax parameters. I put in the corporate income tax rate change into the OGUSA parameter changes, and then I clicked run. And I can share with you some of the results. So first I'll show you the steady state analysis. Okay. And so the steady state results here, we're going to see a couple different pieces of output when we get our output page from this web application. So one is going to be kind of a distributional analysis. So if we look across these different individuals in the economy based on their earnings percentile, what happens to their consumption in the very long run as a result of this tax plan. Okay. So these are percentage changes in the long run. And so this is saying that the very highest income group here, the top 1% of earners, are going to lower their consumption in the very long run by about 0.5% under Joe Biden's plan relative to current law. Okay. So this isn't a huge effect, but again, many of the TCJA provisions are expiring. So in the long run, Biden's plan isn't a big change, although there are things like the change permanently of the corporate income tax rate. And so we're going to have a reduced capital stock. As a result, we're going to have reduced GDP, and that's going to bring consumption down for all individuals. And you can see it's going down more for the very top of the income distribution because that's the group that's facing the largest tax changes from this plan, and also holds the most capital income, and so would be most affected by the corporate income tax rate changes. Okay. So you get a little bit of summary of the distributional analysis, and then you get a table with percentage changes in some macroeconomic aggregates. And you can kind of click on these things and make them bigger. And so we can see things like in the long run, GDP would be expected to go down under the Biden plan relative to current law, but by only about 0.3 of a percentage point. Investment would go down by just shy of a percentage point. Tax revenue is going to go up. Labor supply is going to go up a little bit, but not very much. And so you get some sense of this change in the very long run. Again, not a big change to the tax code after the budget window is over, but nonetheless, you can kind of get a view of these changes, and with other reforms, you might find much larger changes. All right, so I ran the transition path analysis as well. And I'll show you kind of what the outputs look like, although I want to just say that I made an input error, I think, in entering my parameters. But what we can see with the transition path analysis, and let me highlight my error first here, which is that I messed up in how I input things year by year for the tax calculator parameters. And so we got some things off here, and we got some fluctuations over the budget window. Because of my screw up entering the parameters for the tax calculator. But what you can see is that if things are transitory, you're going to get some responses from individuals in the model. Like you're going to get a kick up in labor supply right before tax rates jump up in 2026. You're going to get it again later on in this because I screwed things up. But you can see kind of, let me highlight what's going to be there even if you don't make an input error as I did, which is going to be, you're going to get analysis year by year what's happening to macroeconomic aggregates. Okay. right? We're going to show you factor prices by default and their changes. We're going to show you how fiscal parameters are going to vary year by year. And then give you kind of a nice summary table of what's going on over the budget window and then in the very long run. So these are the steady state percentage changes we saw before, as well as changes year by year through 2030. And then lastly, there's a button to click to download results. And this is going to give you kind of the full gamut of macroeconomic aggregates from the model over the entire transition path. So what you'd get here is a CSV file. It's fairly large, so I'm getting a pinwheel here, but we're going to get a CSV file with year by year, what is GDP, what is labor supply, what are wages, what are interest rates, and so on for each year from that start year that you entered. In this case, it was 2021 when the Biden plan was proposed to start, and then through the kind of indefinite future. So we'll go out 400 years, and by that point, the economy is essentially in its steady state. So you'll get all of those results, and you can make whatever graphs you want with that. All right, so that's still downloading. So let me hand it over to Matt. Matt, if you've got any more questions about this model or the web application, be glad to take those.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, we're back. Thanks, Jason. So thanks very much for going through the demo, and thanks for answering my questions as we started off. One of the things that interests me looking at your results and at the web app is what are your priorities going forward? What are the key places in the model that you'd like to build out, and how do you plan to prioritize those?
Sure, yeah. So there's a number of kind of open issues in the OGUSA repository that I'm working on, but I encourage others to collaborate as well. So Rick Evans is also a core maintainer of the model and has done a lot of work, and we've had great contributions from in the past students like Evan Magnuson and Isaac Swift, who are both on the Econ PhD job market this year from Stanford and Minnesota respectively, and Salim Firth, who's at Mercatus, and Kirk Phillips, who's at CBO. And we want, anybody who's listening, if you're interested, to kind of, contribute to the model. And that's one of the fun things about having a model like this be open source. And another appealing thing to working on OGUSA is kind of having many other contributors and all working towards kind of making the model better piece by piece. And that's something I try to do myself. I try to do at least a little bit of work on one of these PSL models every day. And it's a lot of fun, and you can kind of chip away. There's always some little things to do. So adding another unit test, adding a different plotting capability. And so those are things I've had students contribute to, and those are things I work on if I've just got 10 or 15 minutes here or there. But bigger things we're in the process of doing are adding some adjustment costs to firms, so we can kind of think about investment not responding just immediately to some tax change, like a change in the corporate income tax rate through the Biden plan, but maybe those changes in investment happen more slowly over time. So that's something we're working on. In addition, we're looking at kind of an ability to look at effects across production industries. So right now we have just a representative firm that represents all the industries in the economy, but it's of interest many times to think about how different sectors are impacted by changes in tax policy. So that's something else that's in process. And we've got that working for the steady state. We're trying to work out the kind of time path solution to make that feasible. In addition, I'm seeing a question here from Twitter. Is it possible to analyze welfare? And so right now you can do that through changes in, say, consumption and individuals' utility over time. But something we'd like to add is a better capability to do kind of a more theoretically appealing welfare analysis, like an equivalent variation measure, and so that we could have that built in and you could do that kind of welfare analysis. That's something there's been an issue open for some time now on that type of thing. And then in addition, we're looking at kind of more stuff on the spending side as well. So modeling things like a public capital stock, which you can think of infrastructure might be important. Roads and bridges, airports are important for the private sector's production. And so we'd like to model that so that government spending, could be used in that sense, which might be useful and have useful supply side effects.
Okay, thank you, Jason, very much for the presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And I look forward to seeing everyone again at the PSL meeting next month. Take care.
All right, Matt, thank you.